Hello, APBIO. In this video, I'm going to talk about entire systems that are set up for cell communication to each other and then actually communicate to all other parts of an organism to tell those different parts what to do. So they're communication and coordination systems. Just to clarify, so all cells are talking to one another, but these cells and specifically are talking to each other to elicit responses from cells that are outside that system. So they're actually going to coordinate and communicate with and coordinate other systems as well. So there's two main systems that are set up for coordination and control, and that's the endocrine system and the nervous system. And the first one that we're going to talk about is the endocrine system. And you can see a diagram of both of them over here, a diagram in your textbook as well, comparing. They have pretty different anatomies, and we'll talk a little bit about the anatomy and then also how they work. The notes in this, I'm on page 19 in your notes, and these notes are set up as questions. So I'm going to talk about some of the questions, give you a little bit of notes, and then you're going to do some of the questions on your own. But let's start with question number 1. And let's just define the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is just number 1. I'm talking about the specialized communication system. And I want to stress that it talks both to itself and it talks to other cells and asks them and tells them to do things. And the way that it tells them, the language of the endocrine system is what are hormones. So it produces these substances called hormones in specific organs called glands that control all sorts of things like metabolism. So it controls all of your chemical reactions. It controls your defenses, different types of defenses, not only your immune system, but also your behaviors like fight or flight. It controls all of the balance of the internal environment so that all different life processes can be carried out properly, ensures proper function, homeostasis. It controls reproduction. Those are our sex hormones. It controls both growth, getting bigger, making more cells, and also development, which is the formation of a multicellular organism from a single cell, and more. So we'll write etc., but that's a big wow. So it has control over many different parts of your body or multicellular organisms. One of the things that it does is it talks to itself in what are called hormone cascades. And there are these different systems there are sequences of successive activation of hormones where one gland will produce some hormones, and then it's going to tell, or hormone production, it's going to tell another gland to make some hormones, and then still another. They're different. They're called hormone axes, where one gland will produce a hormone that tells another, and it results in amplification of the signal. Okay, so if we look and see what the endocrine system, where it is, you can draw a little person in your notes. I've got a person here. It's starting up wrapped in your brain, which I think is so weird, are two glands, the pineal gland and the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland really is a master gland, and it's going to tell all the other glands to do stuff. It's super bossy. And then right in front of your neck, if you touch the front of your neck, like right down below your throat there, you have your thyroid and your parathyroid. The parathyroid sort of wraps around the thyroid. And right in the center of your chest, you have your thymus. We talked a little bit about the thymus when we talked about T cells. That's where T cells mature. And then over in your low back, you have your adrenal glands, and then in between your adrenal glands, you have your pancreas. And we'll talk about specific hormones that are produced in these two glands. And then we have the sex glands. We have in biological females, we have the ovaries, and in biological males, we have the testes. Okay, so that's an overview of the endocrine system. Now let's go on to number 2. In number 2, we're just going to talk a little bit about some terminology. So there's different types of intercellular communication. We brushed up against it in chapter 11, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail. I'm going to give you a little bit more language. The crins are to talk about are terms that refer to how messages are being sent. And the endocrine is a message that's sent by a cell is going to produce a particular substance, then it's going to go through the circulatory system. There's not very much of it in tiny amounts, and then it's going to be heard by target cells that are far away. But there's other types of intracellular signaling as well. So what I want you to do is I want you to turn to page 994 in your textbook, and I want you to see figure 45.2. And it's actually this figure right here, except it's a little too small to see in your notes here. And then I want you to fill out the table in your notes. So, for example, I want you to look and see, oh, I see endocrine signaling, and then just draw here in the first, on the far left, well, you can start with endocrine signaling since that's what your book does, and draw a couple of cells, and then show the bloodstream, that's how the signaling molecules being sent, and then you can show the labeled target cells that are far away, and then so on and so forth. So do that, and then you can come back to the video. Okay, so now I'm going to compare and contrast the endocrine and the nervous system. So we're going to talk about the nervous system next class, but today the subject of conversation is the nervous system. But you should know that both the systems work together. To coordinate all body systems. So the cells within those systems are talking to each other, but they're actually really working together. And like I said, the pituitary gland is the master gland of the endocrine system, and it's wrapped in the master organ of the nervous system, the brain. So it's just interesting the way that they are anatomically located right next to each other. You can see that here too. I want to compare and contrast some specific characteristics, thinking about how those systems they do really work differently. First thing let's do is let's talk about rate. So how quickly the signal travels. And in the nervous system, it's like immediate. It's so fast. It's a really rapid signal. As compared to the endocrine system, it's delayed. It takes a bit for the signal to ramp up. Now, that doesn't mean it's slow. It's just slower than the nervous system. It's not immediate like the nervous system. The signal they last different amounts of time. So the response, the cellular response, which ends up being an organismal response, lasts for a different period of time, whether it's the nervous system or the endocrine system as well. In the nervous system, we have a really very short acting. So the cellular response is short acting. On the endocrine side, though, it's a much longer activity or longer acting. That the signal itself stays on for longer. So whatever the thing is that the cell is doing as a result of that signal. The way the signal is delivered is different as well. The mechanism of transit, we can call it that. So how does the signal get to different places? In the nervous system, it's between specific cells. But in that, and those cells are a neuron, and then there's a space, we call that a synapse. And then there's another neuron. So there's two different specific cells that are going to pass a particular signal. But over on the endocrine system, it's broadcast throughout the entire organism. So it's a broadcast signal, or broadcast throughout, I should say. But only certain target cells are going to hear it, and it uses the circulatory system. So while on the nervous system side, it's going between specific cells that are nervous system cells, the mechanism of transit for the endocrine system is on a borrowed system. The molecule, the language of the systems are different as well. The language are the signaling molecules. On the nervous system side, it's a neurotransmitter. That's what the ligand is. And on the endocrine side, it's hormone. And then finally, the organs that are part of the system, because we're talking about a whole body system. In the nervous system, there's a dedicated network. And there's the connections between the organs, we call those nerves. And then we also have your brain. That's the main processing, your brain and your spinal cord, which are your central nervous system. On the endocrine side, however, it's a borrowed system, a borrowed network. No dedicated network, and it uses the circulatory system, the blood. The hormones are produced in glands, and then it's going to use the blood and the extracellular fluid to deliver the signal. Extracellular fluid. And as I said before, the master gland, so the master organ is the brain over in the nervous system. Over here, the master gland is the pituitary gland. Okay, that's it for number 3. Let's turn the page to page 19, and let's talk about number 4. It's a little bit of terminology. Hormones, we've defined that already, but now let's define a growth factor. Because not all signals are going to be produced in glands and sent far away. So when they're not, we need to use different terminology to talk about what they are, just like we talked about with plant signaling. And a growth factor is a protein that can be produced in many types of tissues. And the response that it stimulates is it stimulates cell growth and or cell division. So cells can only get so big, so then they have to divide. Okay, so that was number 4. Now let's go to number 5. Number 5, we're going to talk about an example of paracrine signaling. So paracrine signaling is that you just learned about a little bit earlier is local signaling. So it's cells that are close by. So it's a localized response. And what I want to do is talk about a specific example. A specific example is wound healing. You can see it here, what happens when there's some kind of a wound. So let's diagram a pathway of the wound response. So what happens is, well, the first thing that has to happen is there's some kind of a wound. So let's draw that. There's a wound. You're working and you staple your fingers. So let's draw what that looks like. You have your capillary right here, and you've got red blood cells in it, and we can label those red blood cells. And then you also have these little tiny components in your blood called platelets. And it's just another type of component that's in your blood, and you have this wound. So now you're bleeding. Wah. Now, the next thing that happens is there has to be a clot. A clot forms. And the platelets, what they do is they roll along the edges, and they flow through the bloodstream. They roll along the edges of the capillary walls. And when they find a hole like this, they all collect together. And that's what makes up a clot. There's also some proteins in there that get activated. Fibrinogen is activated and becomes fibrin, and you end up with a blood clot. Now, platelets produce a signaling molecule called platelet-derived growth factor. And they because they're producing that when they're activated when they're all in a clump like this, and when they produce that platelet-derived growth factor, the cells that make up this area right here in this small area can hear that signal. Now let's look and see what that signal looks like. Let's take those cells right there and let's make that bigger in step 3. In step 3, here's those cells that make up the wall of the capillary right there. And those cells are called the endothelium. So they're inside the capillary. And here's that platelet-derived growth factor that's been released right in that area right there. Let's label that platelet-derived growth factor. I'll write that. Platelet-derived growth factor. You can just call it PDGF. It's a mouthful. Anyway, and so what that platelet-derived growth factor does is it turns on the pathway for cell division. You end up with cell division. Now, a specific example, what does that mean? It's a whole bunch of things that happen. If it's a nuclear response, then it would turn on DNA replication. And we're going to talk about DNA replication toward the end of this, or when that happens towards the end of this unit. Okay, so that's number 5. Now let's talk about number 6. Number 6 is a question that I have no idea why, but often comes up on an AP exam. So we're going to talk about Viagra. So one of the things that nitric oxide does is it is going to relax muscle cells. So it's in this diagram, it binds with this guanylate cyclase right here. So here's the nitric oxide, and it binds with this right here. And what's going to happen is that's going to take cyclic GTP and convert it to cyclic GMP. And when it converts it to cyclic GMP, this results in smooth muscle relaxing. So this is the pathway that we're looking at right here. So this is the phosphorylation cascade part of it. Here's the signaling molecule. So here's the signal is here. Signal, and then it's diffuses right through, so it's got an intracellular receptor right here, and then this whole pathway is going to happen. Well, these phosphodiesterases are also enzymes that are intracellular enzymes, and they are going to turn the cyclic GMP back to GTP, and then the muscle contracts again. However, what Viagra does is it inhibits the ability of this and says no converting back to GTP. So that means that it stays as cyclic GMP, and this signal keeps going to keep relaxing the muscle. And when the muscles relax, there's the blood vessels dilate, and there's increased blood flow. And when there's increased blood flow, I'm not going to say anything more, but I think you can figure out what happens. So it's increasing blood flow, and it's keeping the blood flow, that enzyme active. It's keeping that pathway active so that there's smooth muscle relaxation, and it keeps that pathway going and doesn't allow the cyclic GMP to convert back to GTP and turn the pathway off. Okay, now let's talk about number 7, which is about classes of hormones. So hormones can be classified into classes based on their chemical structure. And they are the different types, actually, because of their chemical structure and because of the behavior of that chemical structure, they have totally different mechanisms. Different, we'll call them classes, have different mechanisms. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about the different types and the actual signal reception stage. But then I want to go, you're going to learn about how this is a gland cell. How does that signal get all the way to the cellular response? And there's two different classes of hormones. They can be broken into two different categories, how that happens. So we have the gland cell producing it, and then it's going along this mechanism of delivery, and then there's some type of cellular response. That's what this diagram is showing you on the right. So, but let's first do the signal reception stage. So the signal's been produced. What are the two main categories? Well, the two main categories are water soluble and lipid soluble, and I've given you a little table in your notes. You can put water soluble on the left and then lipid soluble on the right. Now, on the water soluble side, there's actually two different types. There's polypeptides, and then there's little tiny, they're sometimes called peptides, or they're sometimes called amino acid derivatives, and both of these are going to be water soluble. Now, if we looked at a membrane, these are both going to be cell surface receptors. So in the polypeptide, we have a cell surface receptor here. Here's the cell membrane. And the polypeptide is going to bind to the cell surface receptor, and then the signal is going to move inside the cell. So this is going to be a cell surface receptor here on the left. This is a cell surface receptor, because the polypeptide doesn't have the ability to get inside the cell because it's water soluble. Same thing here for the peptide hormones. These, or also called amino acid derivatives, these are just even smaller, but they don't have entrance either. So they also have a cell surface receptor. And the signal itself activates that receptor, and then that signal is relayed inside, but the actual signaling molecule stays on the outside. Now, on the third type are the steroids, these are lipid soluble. And because the steroids are lipid soluble, this is the extracellular matrix out here. This receptor for these is located inside. So this is an intracellular receptor. And the intracellular receptor, what happens is the signal itself moves all the way through the lipid bilayer, and then it activates the receptor inside the cell. So two main classes, water soluble and lipid soluble, but within that, in the water soluble, we have two different classes, and in the lipid soluble, we only have the one, the steroids, which are cholesterol based. That's why they're called steroids. And those are nonpolar, so they can diffuse right through the membrane. Okay. So what I want you to do next is I want you to watch this video. This video is going to talk about how this pathway right here. So we've got a gland cell right here, and then the hormone's going to be produced. It's going to move through the bloodstream. How's that going to work? And it's going to get all the way to the target cell right here is the target cell. And here we have a gland cell. And how does that work? Number 8 in your notes on page 21 goes through, it sorts how the differences between water soluble and lipid soluble. And I'd like for you to be able to organize that in your head. And then that's it for flip notes for today. We'll pick up and talk a little bit more about the endocrine system the next time we talk. And I hope that was helpful.